how did it come about that there had been many massacres before, more violent, and there were massacres afterwards? And yet Recak, this small village where 45 villagers were killed, men and boys, the government at first told us and described to the world that what had happened was a battle between the KLA and the army and the police, in which all the victims, all those who had died, were on the KLA side, and there had been no casualties on the side of the government. That in itself was a little fishy. The day of the 15th, I was in Montenegro trying to get them to allow us to open a KVM office there. And because of conflict between the Prime Minister of Montenegro, essentially a Serb, and the government of Milosevic, they were political rivals. And so I had a very nice day in Montenegro, and they agreed we could open an office there just to stick their thumb in the nose of Mr. Milosevic. So I flew back to Kosovo that night in a helicopter, and when I landed, I was told by my British deputy, a general, our liaison with the Serbian military, that there had been a battle between the KLA and blah, blah, blah. 15 had been killed. They were all in uniform. They all had heavy weapons, etc. And that was at about 10 o'clock at night. I went home. I went to bed. It had been a busy day. I came in first thing in the morning, and my deputy said, "Pastor, there's something fishy with this story about a battle. We had verifiers out there the night before, watching as the police and the military moved into Recak after bombarding the village for most of the day. There was no battle. There was no battle going on in Recak during the day. There was bombardment by artillery from the surrounding highlands, and at the end of the bombardment, the police and the military moved down, and the next thing we knew was a number of the villagers were being carried off." And this is important. In the aftermath, when Belgrade sort of changed their story about it being a KLA battle, they still tried to maintain that these were people who were fighting against the police and against the army. And my reaction, my response to that was, look, even if they were KLA fighters and you captured them in the middle of a battle, you disarmed them, you marched them off unarmed under the protection of your soldiers, and a few hours later they turned up dead. That is a war crime in and of itself, even if they were KLA. Anyway, hearing this from my deputy, we decided to go there and see for ourselves. So we got out to Recak maybe, 10 hours, 12 hours after they had been killed. It was a very bitter Balkan winter. The ground, which out in the countryside is rocky and dirty and full of debris, and we had to go up a hill outside of the village. The earth was full of ice and snow, and I could barely keep my balance as we walked up this ravine. And so to think that the night before, 10 hours before, this had happened, these bodies that we encountered had somehow been tampered with, which is what the government claimed after the idiocy of their explanation was issued. When they first said it was a battle, that these guys were in uniform, none of the bodies were in uniform. All of the bodies were in the clothes of campesinos, as we say in Latin. They were in peasant clothes. The bullet holes in their clothes were all very consistent with them being shot there. The blood was right where the bullet holes had gone in. It was obvious that they had died where we found them. It was obviously they had been killed from gunshots coming down from above. So the government was caught unawares. In previous massacres, the massacre had occurred, the international community or anyone got there late, and they had time to arrange the crime scene. Our getting there within just a matter of hours, they had no time to do anything to change the crime scene. So they kept having to come up with ridiculous stories explaining what had really happened and that Walker was a liar. The more the stories got wild, stories that I and my verifiers had gone up there in the middle of darkness, in the middle of the horrible conditions of winter in the Balkans, amid this ice and snow, and we had somehow changed the uniforms into peasant clothes and somehow arranged the bullet holes to coincide with where they'd been shot, was so ridiculous that then they moved to, well, it was much better organized. It was the CIA, and that Walker was an agent of the CIA. And the more Milosevic came out with these stories, the more the present President Vučić came out with these stories, the more ridiculous it became. And the more journalists came from around the world. The other massacres earlier, sure, a couple of journalists would come up, they'd send a story back to their home newspaper or TV station, and it would come out. 2 days later, it would be old news. The story of Recak was on the front pages of Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, the big newspapers around the world for weeks. And that would not have happened if the story of my team getting there and saying this is what we thought it was and challenging the government to prove otherwise by allowing an independent investigation. So journalists came in, who's the big CNN guy? Wolf Blitzer, people like that came in from around the world. And they would only been there a couple of days, except Milosevic continued to make stupid mistakes. In the first instance, his anger at what I had said, they declared me persona non grata and tried to tell me to leave the country within 48 hours. The international community, thank God, even the Russians went to Milosevic and said, you can't do that. But that generated another series of stories in the newspapers of the world. Shortly thereafter, there was a conference in London looking at Recak. Shortly thereafter, there was a conference called Rambouillet in Paris, in which they tried to make for a peace agreement between the two sides. After several weeks of negotiations, the Kosovo Albanians agreed to sign, even though it was to their detriment to sign. And at the last minute, Milosevic refused to sign, which again generated news around the world that Milosevic was saying blah, blah, blah to the international community. I maintain to this day that if Milosevic had signed at Rambouillet, which was very favorable to the Serbs, today we would still be talking about Kosovo as a province of Serbia. But the man was so ready to say, I'm going to tell the world what happened, and if they don't believe me, tough. This is what I say happened, and you all have to believe me. Thank God there were other things happening. So I'll tell you one of the other reasons that Recak generated the sort of story that went out and the reaction to it by the international community. At the time that we're talking about, mid-January 1999, the leaders of the free world and the leader of Russia all had their own problems. Bill Clinton was involved with something called impeachment over what was her name? Monica Lewinsky. So that was his story in the press, and he was very interested in I don't know, diverting attention from the press to something else. Tony Blair in London, another popular leader, was nevertheless having problems in his parliament with various issues of domestic politics. Jacques Chirac in Paris, similarly, domestic politics wanted him to divert attention. Germany, Schroeder had just come in as chancellor. He had just come into office, and there were all sorts of stories about whether Germany was still going to send its troops overseas, or was they going to confine themselves to German issues. It was all the leaders of the free world, including Yeltsin in Moscow, had problems, and they all, I don't want to say were delighted, but here was an issue they could get into seriously and show the world they were interested in promoting human rights and democracy in Europe. And so they all came together, first in London and then in Rambouillet, the foreign ministers of all those countries, and pushed very hard for a settlement, pushed very hard on the Kosovo Albanians, who, as I say, agreed to sign, pushed very hard on Milosevic, and at the end he just said, go away, international community. And for that collection of sort of events, Milosevic's stupidity, the absurdity of their description of what had happened, the fact that we got there right away and were able to see the scene before it was dabbled with, and then the international community, for once, they did not get together over Srebrenica in Bosnia. They did not get together over what happened in Croatia. But that one event on the papers, front page of the papers of the world, resulted in something quite different. Okay, that's all I want to say about Recak. What I do want to say something else about is Kosovo, the Republic of Kosovo. And I use Kosovo, which I understand is the Serb way of describing the country. Kosovo is the Serb way of doing it, or the international community, because that's the way they've heard it for many years. In the Balkans, the difference between the last letter in a word can mean the difference between opponents. And you got to be careful when you talk to someone, if you don't know what ethnicity they're from, you better be careful what the last letter of the word Kosovo is. I call it Kosovo. I just want to say one thing about it. I am incredibly proud. I've been going back to Kosovo every day on Independence Day celebration, every year on January 15th, 16th, when they have a ceremony. 15,000 people go to this village. There is now a beautiful monument to the Recak massacre in Recak. So I've been going back ever since liberation, and especially since independence. I was there in the parliament when they declared independence, one of the proudest moments of my career. And I'm even prouder every time I go back now, because in my opinion, this small country in the heart of the Balkans, one of the most conflictive areas in the world for the last thousands of years, is today a gem. It is a jewel. Albanians, Kosovars, whether they be Albanian or Gypsies or even Serbs, should be very, very proud of this small nation that in a mere 15 years since declaring independence has shown exactly what Kosovars can do if given the chance to do what they want to do, which is make Kosovo a better place, a democratic place. If you put down a list of everything that I hold, and I think our Constitution holds as being the rights, the Declaration of Independence, the freedoms of free speech, journalists being able to say whatever they want, freedom of speech, all the freedoms that I know of, that I have spent 40 years of my life telling the world about, I'm not sure if my colleagues in today's American embassies are still telling the world about those things, but I was extremely proud of them. And Kosovo today, in my opinion, and in the opinion of others like me who have gotten to know Kosovo, Kosovo is the most democratic country in the Europe, if not in the world. A number of countries in the EU that since independence have withheld recognition from Kosovo, saying you don't do enough for the minorities, you're not doing blah, 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 are themselves much less democratic than Kosovo is. Kosovo is fulfilling all of the principles of democracy and holding to them. The system of justice works. No one is above the law. Everything is there. And yet, very few people, except in Fredericksburg, outside of Kosovo, know this story. And that is one of the reasons I'm so pleased to hear what Anita, what others are saying, what the mayor of Fredericksburg is saying, what all of you, I think, represent in terms of being here today. I tell Kosovars, I tell Albanians from the other homelands, you have to be very, very proud of what Albanians have accomplished in Kosovo, and it's happening elsewhere in the diaspora, in the homelands. But I believe Kosovo can be a example, the light at the end of the tunnel, or whatever they say, for the rest of the Balkans, and that the Balkans can become a much more peaceful place than it was when I first went there in 1998. So I hope not only Anita, but more importantly, those in the crowd who are not Albanians, any chance you get in the classrooms, for instance, to tell the world what a very interesting experiment is going on in Kosovo and what can be done by a people if given the chance to show their best.